Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of Memorable Records here on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. This is Anton Garcia Fernandez talking to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today we have somebody on the other side of the line, um, somebody that has already been here on the Memorable Records podcast. And we're hoping that if there's no problem and everything goes to plan, this will also be a video cast, so you'll be able to see us besides hearing us. Well, he was here a few months ago, actually back in June, when we did a special episode on Bob Dylan's new album, Rough and Rowdy Ways. If you haven't seen that, you can go back to the June programs, June 2020 programs on the channel Anton GF, and you'll find it right there. And now he's back for a chat about the Beatles BBC sessions from the early to mid 1960s. He's a professor of Spanish at Columbus State in Columbus, Georgia, and a good friend of mine and a music fanatic all around, Bobby Nixon. Bobby, welcome to our podcast, Memorable Records.
Hi, and Anton. I'm really glad to be able to do this again. Talk about, an album that I think will provoke a good amount of conversation.
Yeah, this is something that was a huge deal for me back in 1994 when the original 2 CD set of Life at the BBC was released. And I remember, back in those days, I was still living in Europe. I hadn't moved to the United States, and that's all I could think about that day. When I knew that it was coming out, I knew my father, who is a huge Beatles fan and a music fanatic all around as well. I knew he was going to buy it that day, and I knew I'd get home from school, and the CD or 2 CD set would be there, ready to be played. That was a huge deal for me personally. It meant a lot, and these are recordings that have stayed with me ever since then. And I wonder, Bobby, what memories do you have of that day in 1994 when this album came out?
Well, I was looking into this because I had to verify exactly when it came out, and this was something that I looked into. That this was actually the first album of new recordings released in my lifetime. Apparently, the Hollywood Bowl album was released when I was 2, but this was the only one that I was aware of. And so at the time I was living in Oakland, California. And so whenever I had time or any spare money, I would always go down to Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and you had Amoeba Music, where actually Paul McCartney made a recording a few years ago, and then also Rasputin's. And so they would still sell vinyl of new releases. So I was able to get the double album of this Beatles release. And, when I got it, of course, I ended up listening to it over and over, not so much because of the different versions of songs that I knew, but because of all the songs that I'd never heard before by them. And so, it's just a great insight to where they were at that time, because I guess they already had one album out in England, but they were still virtually unknown in the US. They hadn't Beatlemania hadn't started yet. And so it's really great because especially the live recordings that have survived were not great quality because of all the screams and difficulty with the recording equipment. So this was also the first chance to hear, I guess you would call it live in the studio, but for the most part, one takes. And also just, it's a window into the music that they were listening to and what their live shows consisted of. So I was curious what you thought, because when I hear the original Lennon McCartney songs or the George Harrison compositions, the Ringo, I think a couple of compositions on there as well, they seem so different to me than the covers. Even though I think the covers were certainly a huge influence and a large part of who they became, I definitely see a quite a bit of difference.
Yeah, I agree. The thing about this album was that I remember my first real introduction to the Beatles were the blue and red compilations
Hmm.
that I had on LP on vinyl. And almost as soon as I began listening to the Beatles, I also began reading about the Beatles.
Hmm.
Books about the Beatles and their biographies and the story of the band. And of course, in those biographies, I was drawn right away to the beginning of the band, how they started out as the Quarrymen and they went through different phases, the Silver Beatles and all of that, and how they became the Beatles. And then they played at the Cavern and they traveled to Hamburg. It always seemed like such a waste that all of that went unrecorded for the most part. There are some
Yeah.
recordings at the Star Club, but those are already from 1962. I know that they had recorded with Tony Sheridan a few
Yes.
sides, but they were basically the backing band for Sheridan, except for a couple of songs that they did on their own. So all of that really went unrecorded, and I always felt like it was really such a waste. And
Hmm.
I feel like mm, these BBC recordings sort of bridge that gap a little bit, and that really is what I was really excited about when this album came out, because I had read lists of songs that they had recorded for the BBC, but I had never really heard them outside of maybe a couple of examples, really bad sounding examples on bootleg compilations that were
Hmm.
always hard to come by in those
Yeah.
days prior to the internet. So, what really attracted me to the life of the BBC, the first two CD set that came out, was the sheer amount of new music that they never really recorded commercially for EMI Parlophone or Apple later on. And so, that really meant a lot to me because it was through the Beatles that I got into American music. So it wasn't that I knew, Elvis and Carl Perkins and Chuck Berry, and then I heard about the Beatles. It was the other way
Yeah.
around. The Beatles were the gateway for that wonderful American music from the 50s and before. And one thing that I find really interesting is, well, there's two things I find really interesting. The repertoire that they are delving into here, besides their own hits and in some cases fairly different versions of their own songs that they recorded in the studio for EMI. The BBC sessions, in some cases, they don't have piano here, and they have to fill in that void that the piano would leave with guitar, and so
Hmm.
that renders the sound different. So I think that is a very interesting thing. But then there are songs in there that were not really hits for anybody. If you think of
Yeah.
some of the songs that they recorded, you will find some of the hits. Johnny Be Good is on there, Sweet Little 16, blah blah blah. But then you also have Carl Perkins's Glad All Over, which was not
Hmm.
really a big hit. You have songs like Clarabella that
Yeah.
there are songs that you don't hear very often. You even have songs like Nothing Shaking by Eddie Fontaine, which Eddie Fontaine is not the first name that comes to mind when you think of 1950s rock and roll. However,
Right.
the Beatles, had that influence, and I think this really is the live at the BBC recordings are a gateway to understanding the Beatles musical makeup, really.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think Eddie Fontaine, they were really influenced by the film The Girl Can't Help It, and he doesn't sing that song in the film, but that could very easily be their connection for that. I mean, obviously, Little Richard is featured prominently there, and they were touring with him quite a bit in Germany, and they covered a tremendous amount of his music on these recordings and on other recordings as well. Obviously, Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins, Ray Charles seem to be the artists that you see covered the most. I was like you. I think the first recording I had a cassette of it, of the Blue album, and then later on got the red cassette as well. But those were the recordings that I listened to over and over again. But I think when I really realized that I loved the Beatles, I was in middle school, and HBO had released the new film Imagine about John Lennon. And so I didn't have HBO, but a friend of mine recorded it for me on a VHS cassette. And so they showed A Hard Day's Night, and then Help, and then Imagine, and then after that, John Lennon live in New York City. So I had this VHS tape with all of those recordings, and I literally wore it out. I mean, I watched them over and over again. And so, of course, I went to the library and checked out every book on the Beatles I could find. And one of them, like you were describing, had a list of all of the tracks from all of their recordings, but it had very obscure recordings that, were worth a tremendous amount of money. Some of the pre-Capitol releases in the United States, especially, and then the track listing for Australian releases and all of the EPs. And the other thing I think that struck me was how the British recordings, I felt like we were being gypped because they had so many more songs than the American releases. But these songs, I guess when this album came out in November of 1994, so exactly 26 years ago now, I had heard some of them, and then some were later released on the first anthology set. But there was a radio station, well, it's still around, KPFA in Berkeley, and they were doing a fundraiser. And so they played 8 hours of the Beatles one day. And I took all of my cassettes that I wasn't that interested in and recorded over them so that I could get all of these songs. And so they had, I mean, I don't know if they were from bootleg albums or what, but the sound was much better than I expected. And I'm sure they had some good recording equipment. But, hearing them do Roy Orbison covers and Buddy Holly covers that I had never heard, I don't know, it's sort of like these things that you've dreamed about because you've read about them in books, but 10 years go by and then you finally get to hear them.
And that happened in particular, Bobby, with one song in particular, or at least a couple, but one in particular is "Some Other Guy," because that is a song that you always read about in books. That was a huge favorite at the Cavern and a huge favorite at the Star Club, and at the Kaiserkeller in Hamburg. And that is something that I had always wanted to hear by the Beatles. I had heard other versions, of course, by other groups, but the version that we hear on the first volume of Life of the BBC, because we should say that there's two volumes. One came out. This is the first one that came out in 1994. And this one has a live recording of "Some Other Guy" from one of the very early 1963 appearances of the Beatles on the BBC. And it is actually a live recording, but it is a live recording where you don't really hear all that screaming. I'm sure they were trying to keep the fans as quiet as possible, and you really can hear how exciting a live band the Beatles were when they were playing, rock and roll in the way that they were in those early years. And "Some of the Guys" is a good example of that. And another song that I was really, really excited about is "I'll Be on My Way," which the Beatles wrote, and they never recorded commercially and gave, I believe, to Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, and that became a hit for them. But it was never recorded by the Beatles. And it is a, beautiful song, Beatle-like, completely Beatle-like. It could have, fit into any of the early albums that they did, at least early albums by British standards, because as you said before, in America, the albums were different. But, it could have fit in really nicely into, With the Beatles, or, one of those early albums. But they had so much creativity at that point that they didn't need to record their own songs, or at least all of their own songs. They could give some songs away, and in fact, they did give quite a few songs away. And one of them is "I'll Be on My Way." And fortunately, we have a version of "I'll Be on My Way" on that first BBC album. So I was really excited about this because it really was a window into those cavern days, but a window into those cavern days that ensured that because they were recorded by the BBC, the sound quality would be not just acceptable, but in some cases, really, really good.
Hmm. Yeah, and I wasn't sure because I know they thought that the recordings hadn't been preserved in any way, but luckily, I guess some had actually been recorded onto albums so that they could be shipped to other BBC affiliated radio stations around the world. But I think some of the earliest bootleg recordings from the 70s and 80s were recordings that people made listening to the radio when the original broadcast happened. And then, those terrible recordings would be pressed on vinyl and sold as bootlegs. So, that as well. I mean, just being able to preserve it and have listenable copies of it. But I mean, so many of the songs on here, I noticed, I think there are at least 3 that were written by Carole King. And, the song Don't Ever Change, not a famous song at all by the Crickets after Buddy Holly's death. But I think what's so unusual is that it's a duet between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. And I may be mistaken, but I can't really think of any other songs where that happened, and certainly not on any of their official releases.
Yeah, this gave the Beatles the chance to try different arrangements, so to speak, and to have versions of songs that maybe on the record were sung by one Beatle, and then live at the BBC they were sung by another Beatle, and that gives you the chance to compare, how they fare vocally in comparison with each other singing the same song. So that even widens the appeal of these recordings even more. And the fact that the Beatles, who Lennon and McCartney had said at some point early on in their careers that they wanted to be the Goffingham King of England.
Yeah.
Well, they are covering Goffingham King because they like that kind of music, and it influenced their own style, quite a bit. And I feel like while in some cases, for example, on "I'll Be on My Way," if you listen to the guitar solo, it is just a little bit unsure. It sounds a little bit unsure or improvised. Obviously they weren't used to playing that song very much. But on some of the other covers, they just sound so tight. On some of the guy, even on "Don't Ever Change." You can tell that the Beatles had really served their apprenticeship for so many years, and they get to the point of the start of Beatlemania, and they're absolutely ready for it.
Yeah.
And on these recordings, on these broadcasts, some of them live, most of them recorded live in the studio for broadcast, you can really hear that the Beatles are at the peak of their power as a live band. Unfortunately, after 1966, they quit playing live, but at this point, this is really their prime as a live band, don't you think?
Yes, definitely. And again, I remember, I don't know, probably around the same time when I was in middle school, I woke up really early on a Saturday morning, and they were showing this film, and I just was very lucky, turned on the TV, and it was starting, and it was called The Birth of the Beatles. And it's a decent movie. I think it was either directed or produced by Dick Clark, but it's the only film about the Beatles that I had seen. And it focuses on the period with Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best. And at that time, of course, I'd never heard any of the recordings with them, so I was dying to after seeing that film. And also just from that period, it was interesting because I had really fallen in love with the Beatles after seeing A Hard Day's Night, Help, and then listening to some of their later music. But I didn't realize that they listened to the same artist that my father listened to, because these were recordings. My dad had a million compilation tapes that he would buy that we would listen to over and over in the car. So I knew so much of the doo-wop songs, the R&B, and later in life, I would learn that he had actually seen a lot of these artists that the Beatles covered as well, like Lloyd Price and Charlie Feathers and Elvis and
Johnny Burnett.
Clyde McPhatter. And, it's interesting because he would talk about how Lloyd Price would be the headliner and Little Richard would be one of the minor acts at first. And so, which now I wish I could have been there with him, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, some of these artists, but that those were really the artists that the Beatles were obsessed with. The only band I could think of that they covered was the Shirelles, because we got to actually see a concert of them when I was, I don't know, maybe 13 or 14. And at the time I thought, oh, these are very ancient groups, much older than the Beatles. But I mean, the musicians were probably in their mid 40s at that time, and I mean, had incredible voices, but it was a show that Dick Clark had organized in New Orleans. And so the Shirelles were one of the groups. But I thought what is interesting is the two songs by the Shirelles that they cover weren't one of their biggest hits.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't cover Mama Said or Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow or Soldier Boy. And so I thought that was also very interesting, that the songs that they choose or that they chose weren't the biggest of the groups.
And I think that's very important. It is true that they used to play Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow live, but they were more interested in digging deep into the catalog, digging deep into the repertoire, learning the B-sides of the records, which, not every band in Liverpool around that time was doing that. And I think their interest in music and in the more obscure recordings that would just surprise everybody, I think that was a big thing for them. And you can see it, on if you look at the track listing here, you find songs that you can't imagine a lot of the Liverpool groups playing around that time. Songs like Lonesome Tears in My Eyes, written by Dorsey Burnett. Even songs that had appeared around the same time when the Beatles covered them, like Anne Margaret's "I Just Don't Understand," which is it is a fantastic song, but I had never heard the original Anne Margaret version until I heard the Beatles version on Live at the BBC, and then I went and looked for, and again, this is pre-internet. I couldn't just key in, Anne Margaret, I Just Don't Understand, and find a YouTube video of it, But this album in particular, the first of the two volumes, really made me go back and try to dig as deep as possible and find some of these songs in their original versions. For example, "Oh My Soul" by Little Richard, which is a fantastic rocking number, or songs by Carl Perkins that I hadn't heard before, that I didn't know about. And then particularly there is a name that really stands out to me, and that's the name of Arthur Alexander. And the Beatles had recorded "Anna, Go to Him" for their first Parlophone album, "Please Please Me." But on here we get a couple more slices of the music of this great man, Arthur Alexander. We get "A Shot of Rhythm and Blues," which is really a song chock full of rhythm and blues, and "Soldier of Love," which is another beautiful tune. And I remember, Bobby, that after listening to this in 1994, I begged my father, find me a record by Arthur Alexander, and he has turned into one of my favorites from the era.
Yeah, no, and I mean, he was from very, very near where I grew up, around the Muscle Shoals, Florence area, and I'd asked my father about him, and he said that the only song that he actually knew was "You Better Move On," and I think he was one of the artists that his 45s were marketed on London records in England and were incredibly popular. So "You Better Move On" was his biggest hit, and of course that was covered by the Rolling Stones,
and really well too. It's a great version.
Yeah, really good. And so, but I mean, the fact that the Beatles did so many of his recordings, and he was someone that, he didn't record music for very long. And I know he was a bus driver, I think, in the later years of his life in the 1980s. But yeah, I mean, just, I don't know, some of the songs that they would dig up. I mean, even at the start of the album, "Keep Your Hands Off My Baby." I mean, that's not Little Eva. That's not "Do the Locomotion."
That's another Goffin King, right?
Another one, yes. And so, I mean, it's just, incredible. I mean, some of the songs were much better known. I mean, the Coasters, Young Blood, of course, and often some of the more well-known songs I noticed were sung by George. And you mentioned Carl Perkins. I feel like so many of these songs, they were from the very first album by these artists. So Carl Perkins' dance album, and then of course Here's Little Richard, and then Elvis's self-titled album. There were quite a few songs on those. So some of the songs, like I think maybe Money Honey was on the UK release of that Elvis record, not on the US version. And so it seemed like maybe they were able to pick up the first album by some of those. But there was one of the Carl Perkins songs that I know, Lend Me Your Comb. If I'm not mistaken, that was a B-side. So that was not on the dance album, but it was popular around the same time.
And that one's on the second volume, because some of these were left off the original 1994 release. And then I believe in 2013 or around that time, the second volume came out that has, it's also a 2 CD set. And it has some of the songs on there that had been left off the 1994 release, possibly because the sound was not good enough. But of course, 20 years later, or almost 20 years later, the technology had become a lot better, had been improved, and so it was possible to clean some of those songs. And so you will find the one you mentioned, "Lend Me Your Comb," is on here, which is a song by Carl Perkins that they really liked, because they used to perform it live. And I'm wondering if that one might be among the ones that, and I'm talking completely from memory right now, but I think that's one of the songs that they did for their Decca edition, "Lend Me Your Comb" by Carl Perkins. And then you find others, like I'm talking about You by Chuck Berry, and even Stephen Foster's Beautiful Dreamer.
Yeah, and I think also the Lend Me Your Comb, if I'm not mistaken, was on the Star Club recordings.
Yes, it might be the Star Club. I can't remember now if they did it for Decca or not, but for sure it was on the Star Club recordings. And it just gives you an idea of the variety of music that really shaped the sound of the band, from the more rocking rhythm and blues numbers to the poppier sides. There's the Honeymoon Song by Mikis Theodorakis, a Greek composer who was very popular. And in Spain, he was particularly popular in the 1960s. Well, there's Paul McCartney singing that song.
Right, and the song is actually based off of El Amor Brujo.
That's right.
From
Falla.
The Luna de Miel, right? The film, which I guess it's a British director, but filmed in Spain.
Because in Spain, in fact, that song was sung as La Luna de Miel by a singer called Gloria Lasso, who was really popular in Spain in the late 50s, early 60s. But it's kind of interesting to hear Paul McCartney, and it has to be Paul, because you know that Paul likes some of the, poppier, more melodic numbers. So songs like Till There Was You by Meredith Willson, or, this Theodorakis number, the Honeymoon Song. They're really perfect for that kind of style that he favored.
Yeah, and I had read that he didn't actually realize that song was from The Music Man. He hadn't seen, I guess, I don't know if the Shirley Jones film was out at the time, but that he had heard a version by Peggy Lee, and that was when they started covering it. And it's just interesting because it was part of their repertoire very early on, and it's just so different from everything else they were playing. So they would have these loud raucous numbers, and then he would come out and and play till There Was You. I mean, other songs that I wouldn't know if it weren't for this album, Clarabella by the Jody Mars. And so I was looking them up, and I guess they were members of Bill Haley's band. And Bill Haley at that time had left the United States and was really big in England, but his repertoire hadn't changed so much. He was playing the old hits, but people were still very much in love with that period of rock and roll.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that what you mentioned about some of these songs, that really some of these songs were really lost to history, many of them. if not for the fact that the Beatles performed them on the BBC. And so I think that we need to very briefly at least explain why the Beatles were doing sessions for the BBC, because
Mm.
it's not something that's self-explanatory necessarily, but we need to dig into that a little bit, simply because mm, it is important to note that the radio business in England in the early 1960s was completely different from the radio business in America, even at that time, and completely different from what it is now, of course. And in England there was just the BBC. I mean, that's really pretty much all you had. There was no local radio. There was basically no commercial radio other than the BBC, which was state run. And so, there were three networks of the BBC, and ideologically, the BBC was fairly conservative when it comes to music, for example. And so they did not air a lot of rock and roll. They
Right.
did air a little bit, maybe a little Elvis here or there, a little Eddie Cochran, a little Buddy Holly, but that's about it. And they were not really showcasing a lot of the local groups in the early 1960s. But the Beatles became so popular that they simply they had to open their doors to the Beatles, because prior to that, if you wanted to listen to rock and roll, you mostly had to either buy records if you were living in England. I can't even imagine what it would be like in other parts of Europe, but in England, you had to buy records, or you had to listen to Radio Luxembourg, which
Mhm.
was a station that you could hear beaming all over Europe at night, not even during the day.
Right.
So if you were a rock and roll fan, if you were a teenager in those days, and you lived in England, in Sunderland or in Brighton or
Right.
wherever you live, you didn't really have a lot of opportunities to listen to that kind of music. But then the Beatles come along, and the interesting thing, and this is something that is hard to understand now, but there were a lot of restrictions due to the musicians' union. So the BBC was not able to play a lot of commercially recorded music. So a lot of commercial records,
Mm.
they could not be played. I mean, they had to have a specific percentage of time a day where they could play recorded music that was commercially recorded. So what they used to do was just have live bands there, big bands and pop bands and stuff like that, singers. And so what they started doing was specific sessions with popular bands like the Beatles and others to be broadcast. And this is how the BBC sessions really come about. And I tell you, I don't know what you think, but I think that really was a blessing in disguise.
Yeah. Well, and also I think because of the fact that they were from Liverpool, a port city, that there was more music coming from across the Atlantic. And it's just very interesting. Again, what they gravitated towards, and I feel like also perhaps there was a bit more freedom because you didn't have the same restrictions that you had in the States, where I mean, when the Rolling Stones first recorded, there were radio stations that wouldn't play them in the United States because they thought they were African Americans. So you didn't have those same restrictions. And even though, I mean, clearly in Memphis, you have Sun Records, where it was mostly African American recording artists before Elvis and Johnny Cash and were all recorded. But I feel like you didn't have that same restriction in England, and so so many of those groups were much more open
Mhm.
to especially a lot of the chess blues as well. I mean, that was I mean, I often don't see that much of a difference when when you say blues, and then when musicians started gravitating towards Chicago and became electric. I mean, Bo Diddley's as rock and roll as anyone. And I think, you hear the Beatles often talking about Elmore James and Big Bill Broonzy. And, I think they were just open to all the music that was coming in. And, so you hear, I mean, they don't fit neatly into a box.
Mhm.
And I think perhaps because they weren't from the States, they were able to be a bit more open-minded, where in the States everything was no, this is rock and roll, or this is R&B, or this is Appalachian music or bluegrass or whatever you wanted to call it, and because obviously there were prohibitions in what certain radio stations were willing to play.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll never forget, there's an interview with Fats Domino, and they asked him how long he had been playing rock and roll, and he said, well, I've been playing rhythm and blues down in New Orleans for about 15 years, but now they say that it's called rock and roll, and that's fine as long as people buy my records. I'm okay with that. But I mean, you know, it's the same music, and I mean, there's so much great R&B music from the early 50s that when you hear it, you know, it's, you know, or songs like Good Rockin' Tonight that were so much
Roy Brown.
Roy Brown, you know, and of course, you know, the Beatles probably heard later versions by Elvis in different groups first, but you know, I think they really appreciated how, you know, the artists,
Mm-hmm.
you know, weren't discriminatory in the way that the radio stations were. You know, the artists respected all of the musicians, and you know, other musicians, like, you know, you never hear people talk about Larry Williams,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, I guess someone has John Lennon's jukebox, which was a portable jukebox that he would carry on tour with him, and he had about maybe 60 45s on it, and so he had several 45s of Larry Williams, and of course they do Slow Down, Dizzy Miss Lizzie by him, and he's someone that, you know, in the States you never hear people, you know, those were not huge songs,
Mm-hmm.
but of course, you know, he was very close with Little Richard, and you can hear perhaps an influence there as well.
Yeah,
So
in fact, even John Lennon in you know, the rock and roll album, he has Bonnie Maroney, if I'm not mistaken. That's another Larry Williams song. And then there's Bad Boy that the Beatles did as a single. So yeah, I mean, that's another example, as with Arthur Alexander, where after listening to the Beatles cover his music, then I went out and tried to find stuff by Larry Williams, and
yeah,
it is an absolutely fascinating singer. And you mentioned Elvis before, and when I listened to the version of "I Got a Woman" on here on this first volume of Life at the BBC, I can't help but feel like the Beatles got to "I Got a Woman" through Elvis. Like the version
yeah,
that they sing on here is modeled after the Elvis RCA version more than after the original and also wonderful Ray Charles version. So, you know, and even I'm going to sit right down and cry over you. That's definitely not one of the biggest songs Elvis ever recorded. They're trying to
no.
go for some of the more obscure stuff. And, you know, that's one that they don't even play very often on Elvis radio on Sirius XM,
No.
you know, but the Beatles changed it quite a bit. If you compare the original Elvis version with the Beatles version of "I'm Going to Sit Right Down and Cry," it's quite different, really. I mean,
Right.
it's the same song, but their arrangement was different. And I think it's interesting to note that for the Beatles, the BBC meant huge exposure because there was absolutely no competition. It was a monopoly, really, of the airwaves for the BBC. And so, you know, for the Beatles appearing on the BBC in the early years meant a lot of listeners that were, you know, assured if they appeared. So that's something that really appealed to Brian Epstein. And you can see that they appeared so much on the BBC within, you know, 1963, especially in 1963, that's why they had to dig into the catalog, and that's why they really, you know, had to come up with all of these songs, because they couldn't be singing their hits over and over and over again for the
Right.
BBC. And so that's when we have this whole repertoire that we know how to play from our Star Club and Cavern days. You know, let's use this, and it's to the listener's benefit for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you know, we were talking before about how so many of these songs, they kept coming back to them at different points in their career. And so, I mean, when you look at all of the tracks listed from the Let It Be sessions, I mean, obviously the original name of the album was Get Back. And so, you know, and I feel like their love for those songs never went away, but you see even more in depth the songs that influenced them. So whereas they may have covered 4 or 5 Carl Perkins songs in the Let It Be sessions, there are 4 or 5 more that they do, even if just for a few seconds. And so you see just how deep these influences were. And then, of course, later on in the 70s, John Lennon had his rock and roll album, some of the sessions for Walls and Bridges. Of course, he went back to a lot of this music. And then, you know, George Harrison played several events with Carl Perkins in the 80s and 90s. And, you know, of course, Paul McCartney, he did the Russian album, which was
Yeah.
lots of rock and roll covers. And even, I mean, a lot of his live shows in the 90s, the MTV Unplugged, you know, and so I felt like, and then Ringo, of course, did quite a few covers on his albums as well. Did the more poppy Johnny Burnett, You're 16.
Yes, which he sings as You're 19 now, I believe, because he tries to be a little bit more politically correct, but especially because he is in his 80s now, right? So
Okay.
But not to mention Run Devil Run. That's another album by Paul where he, you know, digs into the rockabilly and the early rock and roll. So I think you're absolutely right. And this is something, you know, when we were preparing this, when we were talking about doing this episode of Memorable Records, talking about the BBC sessions, and you brought up the Let Be sessions. I think that's very interesting. That connection between, you know, musical connection between the BBC years and then those fateful 1969 sessions, which to me have always been absolutely fascinating as well, because that's another example where I would read in the books lists of songs and bits and snippets of songs that they recorded during those sessions, but I had never had a chance to listen to them. So hopefully sometime soon, and you know, it had been in the works for this year, but then the pandemic hit, and
Yeah.
you know, it looks like 2021 might be the year when we will get you know, to dig into those many songs and bits of songs that we haven't been able to hear. But there is Bobby, a connection between the kind of repertoire that we hear on the BBC and the repertoire that they jam on and that they use for just fooling around in the studio at Twickenham and then at the Apple studios for that Get Back / Let Be project. How can we explain this? Is this because these were songs that were common ground for all of them and that were close to their hearts, or is there a deeper meaning to that? What do you think about that?
Well, I don't really know, but I mean, I think, you know, when you listen to the recordings, even on the BBC sessions, you know, they start off in, I guess there are some in 1962, but mostly 63 and 64, and then a few in 65. And I mean, just the amount that their style, I don't know, their expertise changed every album every year was tremendous. And so when you listen to, say, the Beatles' first American releases in 64, and then you listen to What's on Abbey Road, I mean, they've gone, they've traveled through many different worlds. And so I think as they became less a touring band and, you know, a recording band, it was always really essential for them to push the envelope as far as they could. And I mean, they were always very experimental and wanted to, you know, take it as far as they possibly could. But I think that for them, it was always very special because this was the music when they formed as a band and when they fell in love with their instruments. And I think that love for the music never disappeared, because obviously, you know, when Paul McCartney goes back and he plays Eddie Cochran 20 Flight Rock, you know, he doesn't need the money, and he's not doing it for commercial reasons. I mean, I truly believe, you know, he's doing it for the love of the music. And I think for them, I don't know, it's sort of like you never forget your idols that you had when you're a teenager. And so when they were that age, they talk about when they got to see Elvis in the movie theater and everyone was screaming, and they thought, yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. And so for them, that's still their idea of what great music is. And I don't think that ever went away, you know, for the four of them. I think that, you know, they're always going back to them, but that's more for the love of the music.
And these are also, at least some of them, were artists that they actually had met in person, not just seen on a movie screen or on TV or anything. But you know, if you're thinking about Little Richard, you mentioned it before.
Yeah.
They played with Little Richard in Hamburg, and same thing with Gene Vincent. For example, they did have the opportunity of actually meeting these people
Hmm.
in person, and their music meant a lot to them for that reason, and also because their formative years were shaped by those artists. In the same way that if I were a musician, which I am not, I am sure that I would always be playing Beatles songs,
Right.
because the Beatles were part of not just my musical makeup, or but they're part of my life, as part of the soundtrack of my life,
Mm.
and there are memories that I have related to Beatles songs, that
Of
sometimes
course.
you're listening to the song after so many years, and the memory kind of comes right up. It's
Yeah.
it's 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 very interesting. So I'm sure that in Paul McCartney playing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran, for example, I'm sure the memory of meeting John probably pops up.
Hmm.
Or when he hears a specific song, he probably remembers the Quarrymen playing that particular
Right.
song. And I think that is one of the reasons why the Let It Be sessions, as difficult as they seem to have been, uh, even if they weren't able to actually record complete songs in many cases, they're just snippets of a song here or there. That's why, to me, they're so interesting. Hearing them do "Ain't She Sweet," without
Hmm.
preparing anything, without rehearsing anything, which is a song that they had recorded, in Germany during those Tony Sheridan sessions. But hearing it 8 years later, when they have been the biggest thing ever
Hmm.
in pop music, is really interesting, because it tells you that they still remember those days, and most importantly, they still remember the music.
Right. And you have to imagine that when they're in recording sessions and, you know, they get tired of having 60 takes of Strawberry Fields, that they're gonna relax by playing some of their early music or early influences. I also had read that in 1964, I'm not even sure where this was, but that Carl Perkins had come into the studio with the Beatles
Mhm.
and that they played for a bit, but it's believed that there's no recording of that session. But I mean, that would be amazing if it turned up one day. But and then of course a lot's been made about when they met Elvis, I guess in Los Angeles. I never understood the context of that, because for some reason I imagined them showing up at Graceland, but I read
Yes.
that Paul McCartney actually went to Graceland just a few years ago for the first time ever. But the story that got out was that he had snubbed them and was really rude. But Priscilla tells a different story, that they actually played some music together and chatted for a couple of hours. That it wasn't all bad like that. Just that Elvis wasn't someone that was starstruck. He never dreamt of meeting famous people. And so who knows? But I read that Paul McCartney actually paid a fortune for Bill Black's stand-up bass
Mhm.
guitar, and that was a band. Once Elvis was off doing other things, that Bill Black had his combo, and then I think I told you this before, but Bobby Emmons, who was from my hometown, played with them, and so my dad got a chance to see them quite a bit at some of the local clubs. And so, I mean, I feel like for him to go out and seek out something from that period of his life, I mean, it's obviously still very important for him. And, obviously, George Harrison was always going back and playing, that kind of music, whether with Eric Clapton or, the shows that he did with Carl Perkins over the years. And, yes, I mean, I think it's nice. It seems like every 10 years they all go back to those songs.
I always have the feeling also that in those days, in those early days at least, the Beatles were really students of the music. They were not just performers, trying to hit the big time, and getting
Yeah.
to the toppermost of the poppermost, as they used to say, right?
Right.
But they were really people that enjoyed the music and studied the music and wanted to go deep into the catalog. And I think, that says a lot about them as musicians, and also as just simply, people who, like you or me, are interested in the music, only that they could play it and they had the talent to, come up with amazing songs that will live on through the decades. And for example, I don't, but the it kind of makes me, in a strange way, it kind of makes me feel closer to them. To realize that I like sort of the same music that they did, and that they were
Mhm.
interested in those kinds of songs, is something that personally, I might sound stupid to some people, but it is important to me. It says something to me. And it's interesting to note also, and I don't want to forget to mention this, that the first time the Beatles appeared on the BBC in 1962, Ringo Starr was not even part of the band yet. So the
Right.
earliest mm, session was, I think it happened in Manchester in the early part of 1962,
Mm.
and Pete Best, on at least two of the earliest BBC sessions, he was actually the drummer in on at that time still, for the Beatles. And unfortunately, the sound on those recordings is not very good, but that proves how early in the game Brian Epstein realized that the BBC really would be a great place, a great way to showcase the boys. And I actually do, or have heard those recordings, because there is this complete BBC sessions 9 CD box set from the Great Dane label. And this is something that, I am really proud of, because this is something that as a teenager I saved up for a long, long time, still living in Europe, to be able to purchase. And this was not cheap, certainly not for a teenager in the mid 1990s. Um, but I bought it in Europe, and I have it here at home in Jackson, Tennessee to this day, because this has 9 CDs with what are believed to be all of the BBC recordings that the Beatles did. Maybe there's some that are missing, but in any case, there's 9 CDs worth of material there. And this actually leads me to wonder, Bobby, why do you think that we only have 4 CDs worth of official releases of this? Because there's a lot more that has not been issued officially. I wonder if it's because there's a lot of
Right.
repetitions. Maybe some of the same songs are done over and over again. What do you think about that?
Well, there's also the Apple release, the
Mhm.
iTunes 1963 bootleg, and on that, there aren't any unique songs that don't appear on the 2 volumes. So I don't know. I was looking at the statistics that 36 of the recordings never appeared on their albums. So I'm not sure. I would have to go through the list, but perhaps all of those appear on these 2 volumes. There were 275 songs total, but only 88 were different. So, which means that there are probably at least 4 or 5 versions of several of the songs. But I mean, I think that, a lot of the recent Dylan box sets that have come out, and all sorts of especially jazz recordings, people want to hear all the versions. I think we were talking about, I guess it's on a European label, but there's a Carl Perkins complete box set with all of the outtakes and everything, and it might be a CD of 18 versions of Blue Suede Shoes.
I think
Well,
that's on
I
Bear.
would like,
That's on Bear Family. I think the German label. Yeah.
exactly. I mean, I would like to hear them. I mean, especially, I mean, not for every band, but for someone that, someone like Carl Perkins, that you don't have a lot of the releases of the early recordings, or a band like the Beatles, where I would like to hear everything they recorded. And there aren't many groups I could say that about. I mean, certainly Dylan a few others. But it's interesting how when box sets were being compiled for Sun Records, but then also for Motown, for Stax, for a
Mhm.
lot of the really key labels of that time,
Chess
that
or
yeah, that well, but for these, that they would actually go to England because of the Northern Soul crowd, because of collectors there had 45s of albums that Sun Records no longer had recordings of, and or Motown. There would be maybe bootleg recordings that had sold in England of different versions of Marvin Gaye singing "I Heard It Through the Grapevine."
mm,
And so it's just interesting how interest was lost, and so labels from the United States had to go to England to find music that they had lost. It's like the town that my mom grew up in Mississippi. There's a really famous blues musician from there, book sorry Book of White, and she had never heard of him. People from the area had never heard of him. I mean, now you see him, they say, oh, I think he was an uncle of BB King. But I remember talking to a friend, actually from Liverpool, who we were just talking about music, and he actually is a musician, and he's like, oh yeah, I love Book of White. And then he started playing several of his songs on the guitar. And so it's interesting how I don't know. It's like something that came from the United States, and so much of the music from the South that it's completely unknown. And I mean, now a place like Clarksdale, Mississippi, which I have behind me, it was because of artists like Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, that there are museums in Clarksdale, and that tourists starting going there. So I mean, it's a good thing. It's just sad that we weren't able to appreciate I guess our heritage or our history here. I mean, and I feel like I'm just as guilty, because so much of this music was created all around me growing up. I mean, maybe before I had been born, but there was a quote not too long ago from Greg Allman before he passed away, and he was saying that rock and roll was Southern rock. So I guess he was trying to justify the term Southern rock, but he was saying, Jerry Lee Lewis from Louisiana, Elvis from Tupelo, of course, Memphis, Chuck Berry from St. Louis, Little Richard from Macon. And I think you've also got to add Chicago, because
mhm.
when the blues artists went there and plugged in, I mean, that was very much rock and roll. And I mean, something that the Beatles also recognized was the at that time what was called the hillbilly influence. I mean, Elvis on right from the start is doing Blue Moon of Kentucky. I mean, clearly a very different
Yeah.
version, but I mean, that was a song that Paul liked to cover quite a bit. So and I think like I was saying before, I think because they were coming from England, I don't think they had the prejudices about, well, no, this music's from this genre, and if you listen or play that music, then you've got to live in the Appalachians, or this music is from Chicago, or this is from the South. And I don't think they had those prejudices, and so they were able to absorb and enjoy all of this great music. And I think that we are able to appreciate it largely because of them.
Yeah, and I
Because
think
I
what you say is very important, because that country music influence, is clearly there with the Beatles, and you can see it,
Mhm.
even in some of the their own songs that they wrote. I don't want to spoil
Mhm.
the party from Beatles for Sale. What
Right.
goes on Rubber Soul, Don't Pass Me By. The
Yeah.
Ringo number from the White Album. But it's interesting because when the Beatles first got an audition with the BBC in 1962, the person that auditioned them for the Beeb, as they used to call it
Mhm.
back then, I don't know if they still do, noted that it was a really interesting band, and that was not as rocky as most, but also had a country and western influence,
Mm.
as they used to call country music back then in England. They
Right.
didn't call it hillbilly anymore. They called it country and western. And I think in America around that time, the same thing was happening. But I think that influence is there from the very beginning, because it was also there in some of the people that within rock and roll they were interested in. People like Carl Perkins, like
Hmm.
Buddy Holly, and many others, the Everly Brothers. So I just think it's very important to remember that by listening to these BBC sessions, we actually have a very we kind of acquire a very good insight into the kind of music that not only the Beatles were listening to, but also the kind of music that would shape their own style. And I think that is one extra reason to seek out these recordings and to listen to the Beatles live at the BBC.
Hmm. And I think also this period, I mean, because they were very much a touring band at the time, um, it's great because you can actually hear them. You don't hear the screams over their music, but it's like when you're younger, you have so much more energy, and you can also feel that energy in this music. And so, I mean, we had talked a bit before about how many rockabilly songs showed up on the Let It Be sessions, but then also, I mean, the love for Carl Perkins in this period. I know there was an interview with Elvis Costello, and he talked about how Johnny Cash's Sun recordings were essentially proto-punk with the the Tennessee Three, and it's just that driving force. But I think a lot of it, is when you're forging a new sound, when you're young and full of energy, that it comes out in the recordings. And I think that that's something not to be missed, especially when Ringo came along, because
Mhm.
I mean, I think that it's his drumming that really gave them that energy. Because when I go back and I listen to some of the recordings with Pete Best, sure, I mean, you hear Paul's voice, you hear John's voice. I mean, there's the guitar, and it's the Beatles, but it's missing the drive that Ringo brought. And I feel like there really was something magical about the four of them coming together and what each of them offered. Someone else I was listening to this interview with, it was a New York DJ when the Yellow Matter Custard album had first come out, and it was something I know, like John Lennon had actually gone to the radio station and traded them a copy of the Butcher album cover because he hadn't heard these sessions. And he was just talking about how um, unique so many of these covers were. And but again, I mean, the fact that even John Lennon hadn't heard them in 10 years, and wasn't aware that there were actually recordings that had survived. I mean, fortunately now we have much better recordings, and
Mhm.
have found many more.
The Beatles also, in many ways, modernized the BBC, because if you get to hear not just the songs, but
Hmm.
also some of the banters, also some of the patter,
Yeah.
back and forth amongst themselves, of course, and they're always witty and they always have this bubbly, exciting personalities,
Hmm.
but also in the banter back and forth with the hosts of the show. It is a striking difference to hear somebody like Brian Matthew or Lee Peters, with their perfectly vocalized, perfect intonation, RP, received pronunciation English, which was
Hmm.
the only kind of English that you could use on the
Yes.
BBC back in those days. And then the Beatles come in with their Scouser accent from Liverpool, and the contrast is just huge, but it works, because they form such a rapport with some of the presenters, as they call them, or compares, as they used to call them in English back
Yeah.
then, hosts of these shows, and also the producers of the shows. I mean, the liner notes of the CDs, Life of the BBC Volume 1 and 2, by Kevin Howlett, mentioned that the Beatles stayed in touch with some of these people,
Mhm.
after they quit performing for the BBC. So, the Beatles contributed to this different outlook that the BBC began to have on pop and rock and roll music. And fortunately, the Beatles were not the only band who did sessions at the BBC. There's a bunch of CDs out there from other bands from the period and later, from Jerry and the Pacemakers to the Rolling
Hmm.
Stones to the Zombies to the Small Faces to David Bowie to Dire Straits,
Right.
all of them did BBC sessions, and this became a long-standing tradition at the Beeb. They were doing this with other bands because they needed to do it, but also because they could see that he was popular. And
Right.
because of that, we were able to see, I think, a different side or listen to a different side of the Beatles, but not just the Beatles, but whole generations of British and even in some cases American musicians.
Hmm. But when you put the Beatles in context, I mean, their sound was so much different from the other Liverpool acts. I mean, so much different than Jerry and the Pacemakers. But then also, they don't cite this as much now, but they used to always talk more about the skiffle influence. You would have artists like Lonnie Donegan, and they're doing, the Rock Island Line, and
Putting
I
on the
mean, there's
Style or Gambling Man or something like
yeah,
that.
I mean, even I think Jimmy Page was like a 12-year-old skiffle artist. I've seen some videos of that. But I mean, clearly when the Rolling Stones came out, they enjoyed a lot of the same music. But I think maybe George had a lot to do with a lot of the music they covered at the beginning, because
Mhm.
he sings so much more during this period than he did on their albums. And I mean, I think George has a great voice, but I think that his influence really brought in a lot of the rhythm and blues music, especially his love for blues guitar. And then of course, Keith Richards was all about the blues, and then Eric Clapton when he came along a few years later. But again, I mean, that wasn't what most of the Liverpool or British acts at the time were listening to. I mean, I think, obviously blues caught on within a few years, and
Mhm.
rhythm and blues. But I think that, the Beatles were fairly pioneer as far as what they were hearing. And I know Brian Epstein had a lot to do with acquiring music for them. But I mean, I think they also went out of their way to listen to everything that they could.
Yeah, and I think you can see that on if you just take a cursory look, at the repertoire that they're delving into and on these BBC sessions, which you can find on two different CDs. This is
Hmm.
the first one from 1994, the Beatles Live at the BBC, and this is the one that I went crazy and fell head over heels in love with when it first came out back in 1994. Like you said, 26 years ago. That's amazing to think
Yeah.
about that. And then in 2013, there was the second one, Volume 2, which didn't receive as much publicity, I don't think, when it was released, but the sound is wonderful. This one, by the way, was also remastered in 2013. So the sound of this 2013 edition is better than the 1994, although I have the 1994 and it sounds good. This is the volume 2. And then Kevin Howlett also wrote some books about the Beatles at the BBC, and this is one of them called The Beatles at the BBC, the radio years 1962 to 1970. And, they really quit performing at the BBC, live at the BBC in 1965, but they would still appear once in a
Mm.
while on BBC uh, shows, perhaps not playing, but, they were interviewed several times on radio. They just didn't need the BBC as much, after they became a huge international success. And so, whereas in 1962, 1963, they would stop everything they were doing to go do a BBC show. And sometimes they recorded a lot of songs in just one or two sessions with the BBC. In 64, 65, they were touring worldwide, and, they were hugely popular all over the world. And so they really didn't need that exposure anymore, but they still kept in touch with the BBC. And so a book like this, The Beatles at the BBC by Kevin Howlett, which is not the only one he's written even a bigger one with more information and
Mhm.
more lists of songs and commentary and stuff. It is very interesting because it gives you not only a glimpse of what the Beatles did at the BBC and how it all came together and how it all happened, but also it gives you a glimpse into a completely different era in broadcasting. And broadcasting is something I've always been interested in, the history of broadcasting. And so books like this also have that that appealed for me. Now, I do have a question for you, Bobby, because I remember when this came out in 1994, I was so excited about this. And it did happen to me that whereas I was also excited about the anthology that came out about a year later and in different in three different installments, I was just not as excited about the anthology. I don't remember being as excited about the anthology as I was originally about the life of the BBC. How does that compare with you? Do you remember feeling sort of the same way or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think when the BBC recordings, when I found out they were going to come out, I mean, it was incredibly exciting because there hadn't been any unreleased Beatle material ever, in my lifetime. So I think that first time was very important. When the anthology came out, there was a lot of hype over it. I mean, I guess one big difference is that when the BBC recordings came out, I went down to the record store and got it that very day.
Hmm.
And when the anthology came out, there had been so much hype around it that I actually didn't go out and buy it for myself. My mother bought it for me, and it was being so heavily promoted that they were selling them at Kroger supermarkets.
Hmm.
And so she was at the supermarket and said, "Hey, I found this. You said you wanted it, right?" And so yeah, I was happy I got the 2 CD set. And when I listened to it, like I was telling you, I'd actually heard a lot of the earlier recordings, the Quarrymen, That'll Be the Day from,
Hmm.
that I had recorded from the radio a few years earlier.
In spite of
And
all the danger, right? The B side that of that acetate that was written by, I believe, I think it was maybe Lennon and Harrison or McCartney and Harrison, something like that. Yeah.
and then like the Three Cool Cats, the Search, and some of those. But because they were rougher recording, some very poor quality, and then or also more false takes and whatnot. It wasn't like these songs where they're complete recordings, but of course they have the energy of
Hmm.
a live recording, but with much better quality. Because the few live recordings I had heard from the Beatles, I mean, obviously the Star Club, I mean, those are very poor quality recordings. Were disappointing just because of that. So I think hearing the BBC recordings when they came out, and how listenable they were, because of the sound quality, but also the energy of the musicians, and the great choice of music as well. And many of the songs, of course, I did know from Chuck Berry, Ray Charles, but as we were talking about earlier, there are so many songs that were just really bizarre choices, or unexpected from groups that didn't have a big career. I mean, there was one, I can't even remember the name, the Donars, I think. It was the
Hmm.
Devil in they did The Devil in His Heart, The Devil in Her
Devil in
Heart.
Her Heart from with the Beatles. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's believed that was their only recording, but it was the Donais, sorry, or the Donais from Michigan.
Donays. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and apparently George Harrison had come across it in a record store, and so they just had a 45 with that, and then a song called Bad Boy, not the Bad Boy the Beatles do, but just the same name, and so they did that cover. So some of these are just really unusual, and they also did lots of songs by what were called at the time girl groups.
Hmm.
And well, John Lennon continued to do more of those. Angel Baby,
In
I
the
think that was
70s.
for
Yeah.
maybe the Walls and Bridges or the rock and roll session. But a lot of these, and Chains wasn't Little Eva, but it was her backing band, the Cookies, but
Hmm.
another Carole King Goffin song. So, I mean, they were very open-minded to all of this. I mean, obviously, I think you could always say Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. I mean, those are the most obvious influences. Carl Perkins, maybe just because of the amount of songs they did by them. And I think you can't overstate the influence that Little Richard had on them, probably from those touring years. But Little Richard, I mean, he made that great first album, but I think that largely he was known as just an incredible performer. And I know
Mhm.
when he passed away, Bob Dylan had stated that he had done some shows with him, I think in the 80s or 90s, and that there was still so much for him to learn from him as a performer. And I've seen there's a, I think it's called Rock Rock Rock, but it's a film
Mhm.
that was done in England in later in the 60s, like maybe 66, 67. But it's Jerry Lee Lewis, kind of after his fall from grace in the US. He was still very popular in England. And Little Richard, if you haven't seen it before, there's a Little Richard singing Whole Lot of Shaking Going On
Mhm.
after Jerry Lee Lewis had already sung it in the same show. And I mean, he brought the house down. Like he one upped him with his own song. And I mean, you could just hear, especially those early recordings, "She Loves You." I mean, when the Beatles scream, I mean, I feel like so much of that came from Little Richard. And
Oh yeah.
people would laugh at him in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when he would say, you know, I gave the Rolling Stones their start, or the Beatles, and people were, kind of thought of him as a joke, but it was all true.
Mhm.
And if you ask the Beatles, they would say, yeah, he did. I mean, and when also, I think these recordings help to verify that, because you hear Paul McCartney singing, Long Tall Sally, and I mean, so many Little Richard covers, but you hear him in so much of that early music as well.
I hear it even in "Oh Darling," and he's singing "Oh Darling." That
Yeah,
kind of reminds me of Little Richard a little bit. And maybe Little Richard didn't give them, their first recording contract or anything like that, but
sure.
definitely musically, he definitely had a lot to do with that. And since you mentioned the Star Club recordings, that's a dream of mine, that one day the technology will allow us to clean those
Hmm.
recordings, as much as possible, and maybe at some point, hopefully during our lifetime, they will see an official release with better sound. But until that
Hmm.
happens, it is the BBC sessions that we need to look to in order to hear what the Beatles sounded like as a live band in those early years. And I think it's really, I don't know if it's a simple or a complicated twist of fate, but in any way, it was wonderful that the BBC was there to make those recordings and chronicle those early years of the Beatles. We've been talking for almost, I don't know, an hour and 15 minutes already, and there is so much more that we could say, really, because this is a topic that is fascinating to me. It's always been really close to my heart, but sort of as a way to wind down this conversation about the Beatles BBC sessions. Bobby, there's two final questions that I would like to kind of put on the table, and they're kind of related, I think. First of all, if somebody doesn't know the BBC sessions, which I find hard to believe. If you like the Beatles, if you know the Beatles, you will have heard these. But if somebody out there doesn't know these recordings, why would you say that these recordings are important to anyone interested in the Beatles? How important are they to you personally? And why should people seek out at least these two albums right here, Life of the BBC Volume 1 and Life of the BBC Volume 2?
Um, well, first of all, I think it's really the only high quality recordings that we have of them performing live, even though it is live in the studio, which is, sometimes, though, there were small audiences present,
Hmm.
because you can hear people laughing when they tell jokes, and in the banter in between songs. Of course, it's not picked up on the recordings, but I think most of all, you hear the Beatles as sort of during their time as a touring band, and you can tell also the difference with the songs that were very well known, songs like "She's a Woman." I mean, they did "Help," "Hard Day's Night," and they're incredibly different. So I mean, the Beatles, a large part of their success in their recording was, of course, the mastery of George Martin, and what he could do in the studio. But often whether there were strings added or overdubs and whatnot. And here, this is really the only place where you can hear them without any I guess studio tricks or
Gimmicks.
or yeah, or patch ups, how and you hear them, you hear George hit a wrong note on his guitar, or you hear John's voice crack, and that's great. Because so much of what I've heard from the Beatles, like on the anthology, those are the only recordings that have left me disappointed in some ways, because like when I hear outtakes by Dylan, I almost always like them better than the official recording. But I feel like the Beatles, I mean, in their later years, they absolutely were a studio band, and so the finalized work, I mean, it's unbeatable. But I think these early sessions, are a real exception, and you see what attracted crowds to them, because people would go to the Cavern Club, they would follow them around England, and then obviously when they came to the States, I mean, that was a very different stadium atmosphere. But I mean, there was something magical about them, and I feel like here, this is sort of the only unfiltered version that you'll get of that.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting to think about the songs that they did not do and why maybe they didn't do them. Maybe because they were just album tracks, although they do some
Mhm.
album tracks, like Things We Said Today, as an
Mhm.
example. And maybe some of them they don't do because technically they were just not able um, to recreate them in a BBC setting. But for sure, I love these recordings for many reasons, but uh, most of all because they show us, the Beatles said, the peak of their power as a live act, and also in a proper setting, like you say, with good sound engineers and good producers. Bernie Andrews or Terry Henneberry, who were the BBC producers that were able to capture the Beatles' life in one take in many cases, and
Yeah.
and make them sound really really good. No screaming from frenzied fans,
Yeah.
and again, digging real deep into the catalog, into the repertoire to satisfy the BBC's constant demand for appearances and for materials. So I think
Mhm.
it was just a very exciting moment in music history, in British music history, but in music history in general. And the BBC was there to chronicle that, and I think they did an outstanding job of it. And fortunately, we have these official releases and even some unofficial ones. And I'm hoping that maybe one day somebody will see fit to release the whole thing, because as you say, I don't mind listening to 5 different or 10 different versions of Help. I really don't.
Yeah.
Just like I don't mind listening to, you know, um, I don't know, 15 different versions of Visions of Johanna. It's fine with me.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that. So hopefully, Bobby, one day that will happen. I don't know if you have
Mhm.
any closing comments or remarks that you would like to
Well,
add to our conversation, which has been really really interesting as always to
yeah,
me.
I thought it was going to be very quick, but I think again, it's an endless source of interest for me, and which I think led to a great conversation. I think I have a wish that, in the future, I don't know how possible this is, but it would be really great if a video would turn up of them actually going into one of the studios to record, because I can imagine that they were very hurried sessions where they would say, okay, you've only got 45 minutes to do this recording, wait for this act to finish up, and then rush in. But the BBC, especially during that time, had a bad reputation for not saving
Mhm.
anything like that. I mean, even what was broadcast, because I know Dylan had appeared on the BBC a couple of times in the early 60s, and but they didn't even record the performances, and of course people didn't have VCRs at home. But it would be great to see a video of what those sessions were like. I mean, maybe there's some footage out there. It'd be nice if it were added maybe to the digital content. And I would also like to see um, hopefully soon, a digital version of the anthology, because there's also a lot of great footage from that period,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of performances that I had never seen before, especially shows in Sweden and different places during their touring years. And when Ringo was replaced briefly when he was sick, I think around maybe that was 65. Um, and so I hope that that happens. And then, of course, as you were saying before, with the Let It Be sessions, a listenable box set of all of those, where I could actually go and find the tracks that I want to hear, and with all the banter, I would like to hear that, even if they're not always pleasant.
I agree, and I think we might be getting closer to that every day, because supposedly next year we're going to be getting this kind of release. It might not fulfill all of our wishes, but it's
Right.
better than nothing, and really it's long overdue, because it's been a long time in the making, and we have been wishing for something like that, the Let Be / Get Back sessions
Mhm.
for a long time. So hopefully that will happen. And if it does, Bobby, maybe we should just meet again and talk about it.
Right.
You know that you're always welcome on the channel. You're always welcome on the Memorable Records podcast and videocast. It's always a pleasure chatting with you. And we have to keep talking about more episodes of the Memorable Records podcast together, like the one we did about Bob Dylan's Rough and Rowdy Ways, and this
Mhm.
one from today, analyzing and talking about the Beatles BBC sessions. Thank you so much, Bobby,
Thank you.
for your time and for agreeing to appear again on Memorable Records, and hope to see you again around here before too long.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you.
This has been a new episode of the Memorable Records podcast, videocast in this case. Bobby Nixon, professor of Spanish at Columbus State in Columbus, Georgia, was along with us for the ride today, a ride into the BBC, and the Beatles. This is one of the records from 1994, BBC, Life of the BBC from the Beatles, Volume 1. And then in 2013, there was Volume 2 of Life of the BBC, with other tracks that did not appear on the earlier one, although some are doubled. And in some cases, of course, if they're doubled, there will be different versions. And I have to absolutely recommend this book. You can still find it secondhand by the great Kevin Howlett, who knows a lot about the Beatles and their relationship with the radio. The Beatles at the BBC, the radio years 1962, 1970. And if you're lucky enough to still find a copy, pick it up. Not cheap, I can't imagine, but this is the complete BBC sessions. One way of finding the most complete um, versions of the Beatles BBC sessions, until EMI at some point, Capitol at some point, will decide to release them officially, complete from 1962 up to 1965. Thank you very much, everybody, for being out there and listening to and watching this episode of Memorable Records. Thanks to Bobby Nixon for being there as well. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and mine, and also Bobby's, is the copyright of this podcast, videocast, that was recorded live in Jackson, in the state of Tennessee, in the United States of America, in November of 2020. And very soon you will be able to watch it and listen to it on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Thank you again for being there. And now it's time to turn the radio on and listen to the BBC sessions of the Beatles. Bye bye, everybody.